Welcome. This is the early word, words of encouragement from our religious leaders. This morning our speaker is Elder Robert Zamora. This sermon, entitled Requiem for a Dead Church, was first presented at Sligo Church on December 8th, 1973.
I really am glad that you came. I just want to see how many young people are here this morning. Would you raise your hands, please? Elder Hancock, I want to introduce you to your army. They're the finest young people you'll meet anywhere in the world. And I'm so proud that God has given me the privilege of being able to associate with them, because they make my life worthwhile. And I'm so glad to see you this morning. And God bless you. Really, God bless you. You know, December is that month of the year that directs our attention to the birth of Jesus, doesn't it? And you know, I'm very glad. So glad that somebody thought of the idea of, remembering his birthday, because, it imparts such a wonderful spirit to the human race. And it just seems appropriate that, being so close to this Christmas season, we should utilize something from the birth narratives as a basis for our considerations this morning. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go to Luke chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. However, you may be wondering what in the world a text from the birth narratives has to do with a requiem for a dead church. In fact, Elder Eagle mentioned to me in the first Sabbath, he said, you ought to explain what the word requiem means. This morning my wife came to me and said, she walked in with a little dictionary and she says, now would you please tell me what requiem means, because I know the children are going to ask me. And I looked it up in the dictionary, and it says a requiem means requiem mass. Well, that didn't give you any definition, did it? Actually, the word requiem is the Latin word to put to rest. So a requiem mass is a mass that is involved in putting someone to rest. And what we're talking about this morning is a requiem for a dead church. Now let's read these texts and reach deeply into the heart of them to discover just exactly what message they have for us this morning. And I'm reading Luke 1, verses 26 and 27. And in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. There's two important things to notice in this text. First of all, the localities that are mentioned. And secondly, the personality that is mentioned. And each one of these has a very important message. It's the basis on which we want to, build our considerations this morning. First of all, let's look at the localities. You notice that in the text it was to Galilee, not Judea, that the angel was sent. To the city of Nazareth, not to Jerusalem. And to the home where Mary dwelt, not the temple. Now this is very significant. Why? Well, because if you remember, God had chosen Judea as the center of the land, as the theater of his operations for the centuries. Jerusalem, Jesus called it the great city, or the city of the great king. The temple was right at the center of the city. It was the very dwelling place of God, the place he was to manifest himself and to his people and hold communion with them. But when the heavenly messenger came to them, came to this earth with the stupendous news. He passed over Judea and went to Galilee. Galilee that had been held in contempt for all these centuries. You go all the way back to Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 1, and you'll find that even way back there, it was overrun by Gentiles and was held in contempt. At this time, it was the tetrarchy of Herod. He had built a big temple. There were pagan temples there. And in this place, the games of pagan people were played, and they demoralized the inhabitants. Therefore, Judea, down there in the south, in the proud pride of place and power and position, still held Galilee in contempt. But it was to Galilee that God's messenger was sent. In passing Judea, he passed Jerusalem too. As we said, it was the city of the great king, but the angel passed it and came to Nazareth. The town of Nazareth, you see, was situated about 70 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was a kind of a halfway house between Tyre and Sidon and Jerusalem. It was connected by a great highway. Nazareth was up on the hillside, and down below was this great highway they passed on the way to Jerusalem. And on that highway passed Roman soldiers and Greek merchants and Greek travelers, Jewish priests. We kind of think that Nazareth must have been a little tiny town. No, it had at least 15,000 people living there. At least. It was one of the big cities of Galilee. And being where it was geographically, it was the place where the Roman soldier used to spend the night, and where the Greek merchants with their caravans put up their tents. And you can imagine, Nazareth was a hotbed of corruption. And we don't have to go into detail. All you have to do is just let your imagination run, and you'll discover, or at least you can come to some kind of understanding of what the conditions were. It's easy to understand what Nathanael meant when he said, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" He ought to know. Because he was brought up in the neighboring town of Cana. That's where Nathanael came from. So it was to Nazareth, perhaps one of the most corrupt towns to be found in all the region at that time, that the heavenly messenger came. And he came into the home of a young maiden by the name of Mary. And here's where we have the personality. Now, every time I teach my Jesus in the Gospels, I stir the pure minds of my illustrious, brilliant students when I tell them that Mary possibly could have been about 14 years of age. Now, that didn't seem to bother God much, because to him, neither rank, nor station, nor age are of any consequence. Whatever her age, she was an extraordinary young lady. I wonder what they were saying in Jerusalem among the proper ladies in the aristocratic priestly courts. Why that peasant girl? Surely the priestly family has much more worthier candidates. And you look at that girl. I like what Peter Marshall says. She of all women on earth, of all the Marys in history, was to be the only one who should ever wear entwined the red rose of maternity and the white rose of virginity. Insignificant as she was in the eyes of the world, she was the elect of God for the fulfillment of that tremendous office of being the mother of the Messiah. And the more I learn about God, the more amazed I am at the simple, humble ways he goes about saving the human race. But you look at that girl, afraid, faltering, never really getting the whole idea of what was going on, never really comprehending the whole mystery until after Pentecost. And yet she was so quick, moved by the simple devotion that was the impetus to her obedience, to say, "Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." A humble girl. So let's review. The heavenly messenger passes by Judea and goes to Galilee. Passing over the city of the great king, he goes to Nazareth. He passed the temple and entered a house. Something was about to happen on earth which all heaven was watching, which things angels desired to look into. And surely they were watching Gabriel, the messenger, going down to earth with that message. They saw him pass Judea, Jerusalem and the temple, and go into the home of a peasant girl in Nazareth. Why? Because the land of Judea was blighted. The city was blasted and the temple was degraded, and God's messenger passed them all. God left the land of his choosing. He abandoned the city of his love, and he passed the temple of his own appointment. Why? Why would he do a thing like that? Well, it's not always easy to understand. But when you read the history of God's dealings in the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in church history, you are impressed with a very, very clear fact. And that fact is that God, in his actions in human history, is independent of his own institutions when men degrade them. And this, my friends, is an astonishing and frightening revelation. It shatters our man-made security and causes us to wonder where we are on the scale of God's evaluation. Now, anybody who is a student of the New Testament has always been considering why God rejected Israel. Now, you and I, we sit back here and we look back then and we say the judgment was just. But have you ever stopped and really thought through why? We say, oh yes, well, it's because they rejected Jesus as Messiah. But did you know that that was a symptom rather than the cause? Do you realize that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John try to explain that very thing? They're trying to tell us why God rejected them. Did you know that? You take the Gospel of John alone. When the Christians went out into the world, the people used to say, oh, Jesus was a Jew. He's the Messiah. He's the answer to the world. Well, tell us, why did his people reject him anyway, if he was so great? And John sits down and he writes his gospel, and in his gospel he tells us, you ought to read the 12th chapter of John. And John tells us that they rejected him because of a certain condition that they were in. He tells us that through all the life and ministry and even the trial of Jesus, that it was never Jesus who was being tried, it was the Jews that were being tried. Now when you get over to Paul, he's even more impressive. You take the letter to the Romans, and in the letter to the Romans you have 4 chapters dealing with that very question. 4 chapters. Do you see why I say to you this morning that this topic is so important? If the New Testament takes all that time to explain it, then there must be some reason. Let's take Paul, see what he does. You look in the first chapter of Romans. In the first chapter of Romans, like a good Jew, he gives us the ghastly condition of the world, of the Gentile world with its proliferous wickedness. And to a Jew, such a description of Gentile decadence was such a reassurance of their standing before God. You can almost see them clapping their hands and say, "Right on, Paul, right on." And then Paul shifts gears. And in the second chapter, he lets go. Now the real core of it is found in verses 17 through 24. Before this, you see, he talks about how these people who were judging those were judging themselves because they were doing the same thing. And then when he goes through this whole thing, he says there in verse 17, "Oh yes, you rest in the law. You make your boast of God. You know His will. You approve all these things. And you even think you are an instructor out of the law, and you're confident that you're a guide to the blind. You're a light to them that are in the darkness. You're an instructor of foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge. You know the truth in the law." Hey, he said, you who teach, don't you teach yourself? You that preach you shouldn't steal, do you steal? You that say you shouldn't commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhor idols, do you commit sacrilege? Do you know what the Jews are doing? You know what this abhorrence is? It's a physical revulsion. They couldn't stand the thought of idols. But do you know what they used to do? They used to go into the temples and steal the golden idols. Isn't that interesting? Whenever there was a chance of gain, those who shrunk in horror from idols would without misgivings come into contact with the system. You make your boast of the law, and through breaking the law you dishonor God. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. Can you imagine? The agencies of God to reveal His character, and God's name was being blasphemed among the nations because of the Jews. The instrument of honor became the cause of blasphemy. And Paul said, you're not any better than the heathen. And so his opponents were ready to hit him. He says, well, if we're not any better than the heathen, you tell us what advantage is there in being a Jew. That's verse 3, chapter 3. And Paul says, oh, much in every way. But Paul's every way wasn't the Jews' every way. They thought that it was an advantage just to be a Jew. That carried its reward. But Paul said the advantage is not in just being a Jew, but that the oracles of God were committed to you. The oracles of God, what are those? Well, it's the word logia, which actually refers in general to the whole of the Scriptures, and in particular to the promises of God. God had taken the Jews, this whole nation, and He said, you are going to be my channel for my promises to the whole human race. God said, I'm going to make you my instrument. so that I can spread my promises all over the world. But you see, the Jews made a terrible mistake because they believed that those promises belonged to them. So those promises of God, instead of leading them to humble obedience, entrenched them in a false security that somehow by being Jewish, they would avert the judgment of God on them. Instead of the promises leading them to humility and dependence, it led them to arrogance and pride and self-sufficiency. They were not interested in what God had to say to them when He came. There was nothing more to be said. They looked forward to the day of the Lord, the day when God would judge the heathen, the day when Israel would be vindicated in the eyes of all the nations. They used to talk about it and sing about it and pray about it. They would be vindicated before the nations, but the prophet said to them, "Woe unto you who desire the day of the Lord. It will not be a day of light, but it will be a day of darkness. It will be like a man who's trying to get away from a bear and bumps into a lion and then runs into the house to hide and leans against the wall and a serpent hits him." When I was here at Columbia Union College back in 1951, there was a teacher there by the name of Elder Livingston. Some of you remember the good pastor. And he said something in a class that to this very day I can remember. And this is what he said. He says, there's something we must learn, and that is that God is not looking for pets that He can spoil, but He is looking for servants. And when He finds them, He showers them with privileges and puts them in the best places where they can do the most good. And God scoured throughout the earth. And He found a place and He said, I'm going to put them there. Because that's the best place for them. Because they'll do the most good. And He said to them, I'll do miracles for you. I will drive them out. I will do things for you I wouldn't do for anybody else. Because of your father Abraham, who was my servant. But you see, when you quit being a servant, the privileges are removed. So in the midst of all this security, this hiding in the promises of God, which they thought was their legacy, Jesus came and He said to them, and you can read it in Luke 19, starting with verse 42. And by the way, He started saying this after He had a very good cry. He wept. He looked at the city and He wept. And then He said, if thou hast known, even thou, at least in this thy day. We're not talking about the past, Jesus. I'm not telling you about what you should have known before. I'm just telling you about today. If you'd known just today the things which belong to your peace, but how now they are hid from your eyes. For the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee. And they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. your house is left unto you desolate. And just take a good look at that temple. Here they were in all their pomp, in all their ritual. They had it all fixed and planned and beautifully, sacrificing to a God that wasn't there. Naturally, he wasn't there. He was out there with that ragged little band who were preaching that the Messiah had come. And Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth." He was talking to his disciples. "But if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under the foot of men." Now, when we read those words, we think Jesus was just being rhetorical. He wasn't being rhetorical. He was laying down an everlasting principle. A principle that still works. Volume 8, page 127. "Let men become lifted up in pride, and the Lord will not sustain them and keep them from falling." Let a church become proud and boastful, not depending on God, not exalting his power, and that church will surely be left by the Lord to be brought down to the ground. Let a people glory in wealth, intellect, knowledge, or anything but Christ, and they will soon be brought to confusion. She understood the principle. Did you know that Christianity is suffering that fate today? The people of the world are looking to Christians and they say they are good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled under our feet. When I was in England, I went with one of our pastors. I was up preaching in his district, and they had just bought a church from the Methodists for about $3,000, about 1,500 pounds, something like that. And the church was bigger than this church. And they were remodeling it. And beautiful church. The pipe organ, why, you never saw anything like it. And they said, "Do you know what, Pastor? The Methodist Church this year has sold 1,700 of their churches because they can't fill them." You look at those beautiful cathedrals reaching for the sky with the glory of God shining through their stained glass windows, and their choirs chanting as they go down the aisle music you've never heard, singing to empty churches. Methodism, the cradle of its birth. Methodism is dead, almost dead in England. Somehow it changed. It failed to fulfill its function, and it lost its privileges. And if you think it's easy for me to stand up here and talk to you about such a serious thing as this, you've made a terrible mistake. Last night, I've been working on this thing for so long, and last night I tried to put it together. I couldn't. I couldn't put it together. I went to my wife and I said, I can't get this thing together. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. I think it's all wrong. I can't do it. And she said, like a loving wife, preach another sermon. But I said, I don't think they need another sermon. You know, we are standing at the most auspicious point in the history of the world. Now, you know, it's very easy for you and me to sit here and we say, well, the problem is our leadership. Why don't they inspire us more? Why don't they do this and that? Do you know that the Church of Christ is not just the leadership, it's you and me? There is something that we need to understand about the church. It's not an organization. It is individuals who have individually made Christ their Lord. They have accepted his teaching and they have shouldered the mission that he came to accomplish in this world. And it is to these people that Jesus guaranteed power. The organization, my friends, is only a device which gives the church mobility and facility to carry on its work. You don't join the Adventist church to be saved. You join the Adventist church to work. And the challenge that these times throw down to us are a time when we should gather together. You know, the thing that bothers me is that when we keep talking about Adventism as a church, it's not a church, it's a movement. And do you know what it means to join a movement? It means that your time, your money, your talents, everything is for the cause. And you don't sit back and you say, well, should I accept this call? Let me see what are the advantages of that call. You don't say, well, I can't do that because I get cold feet in that kind of climate. Send me to a warmer place. When you have the cause at heart, you go where you go and you do what you do in order to accomplish the mission given to us to do. And as I said, the church, Christian church, is under severe criticism. And there are some people who think very positively that it has outlived its usefulness. They believe that it's something like a shell that you find on the sands of a beach. It was once inhabited by a living thing, but it's empty. It's beautiful to look at. You pick it up and you enjoy its beauty, and you may even keep it, but it is no longer inhabited. It no longer lives. And I confess that in my opinion they have more ground than I wish they had for feeling the way they do. Because people who think in these terms say the church for the space age, forget it. It's about as appropriate as an old covered wagon on a 6-lane highway. Oh yeah, it reminds you about the old days when everything was simple and slow, but it has no place in it. Well, I have to tell you this morning that if there was ever a time that the world needed the Church of Jesus Christ, it's today. The voice of God. But once we lose our function, we lose our privileges. Now, once I came across an article written by David Poling. And by the way, David Poling is an evangelical, if you didn't know that. So when you listen to the words I have here from an article he wrote, don't look at him as someone who's a left-winger. He's not. But he understands what is happening in the church. He wrote a book called Can Christianity Survive the Church? And he laid it out. And when I read this, I was indicted. I don't know about you, but I was. I don't know if you will be, but I know that I was. And I can't read you everything that's in this article, but it's the most stirring thing you ever read. And he starts off like this. In one of his mad moments, which seemed to be most of the time, Karl Marx said that religion was the feelings of a heartless world. His angry tone expressed the smoldering suspicion of many people who had expected so much of the church and who experienced so little. They knew that the Bible was saturated with breathtaking ideas about love, about justice, and concern for the suffering. Yet the performance of the church, especially during the turbulent eruption in the 19th century Europe, which saw the overthrow of governments and the rise of expectant people, fell far short of all those biblical ideals that the clergy expounded. When an institution has anointed kings, blessed generals, and consecrated czars, that institution becomes part of the scenery. It comes to represent the status quo, and instead of being in the trenches, instead of shouting words of encouragement and giving support to those pursuing the yearnings for a better life, the church has too often been the agent of repression and compromise, revealing the actions of those who have a hold of a good thing and fear its loss. When the church gets cautious, when the church gets clever and calculating, it is dying. And so it must be asked in the starkest, most shattering way, can Christianity survive the church? Consider the past, even some of the events which followed Marx and the revolution in Russia, 1917. It is reliably reported that when Lenin and his most trusted aides were making their final plans to seize control for the communist cause, they met in a small room in Petrograd, now Leningrad. The air was electric with unrest, for a nation was groaning with abuse and gasping for air as it suffocated in the clutches of a decaying imperial society. And in the midst of the horror story, just 2 blocks from Lenin, where he was holding his revolutionary strategy sessions, met the leaders of the Orthodox Church. And of all the urgent topics that might have been considered, all the alarms and warnings and all the worries that might have been discussed, these prelates held lengthy discussions on the color and cut and style of church vestments. He goes on, we have the right, the absolute demand to expect that the church shall not be the chronic patient in a sick society, with a message no bigger than wardrobe patterns and conferences on the thickness of carpeting and leaded glass. Our problem right now is not that the church has failed, but that it has become, in treasury terms, so successful. As someone has said, it went out into the world to do good and ended up doing very well. The businesses of religion for too many churches and ecclesiastical organizations is to exert a shrewdness, an investment strategy that reeks with financial success in dollar terms, but that can actually be opposed to the Word of God. How can the church travel light, spark moral courage, and stimulate ethical nerve when it runs resort hotels, leases Yankee Stadium, swings $100 million Florida land deals, funds shopping plazas, wineries, girdle factories, and 5 and 10 cent stores? It would appear that where the Bible speaks of the followers of Jesus as being fishers of men, we now see an institution that wants to franchise the fishing business. In the light of the church's worldly involvement, one would not be surprised to see a bishop negotiating with Aristotle Onassis for a shipyard. We already own the graveyard. If Christianity is to survive the yearnings of a big business church and the achievements of a successful religious conglomerate, it will reject expansions of buildings and warehouses and resorts. Instead of pursuing the dollar and property, it will pursue people in the hard and weary world. These are the spiritually rewarding chores that Jesus held so sacred. Going out to the sick, visiting those in prison, claiming the lonely and the lost, staying ever present with the torn, the worn, and the worried. And he says that the day of the layman has arrived. Now I know you don't want your church to be like that. You don't want it to become that way. I don't either. But it's going to take an absolute, determined, outright dedication that says, I care for what this church stands for. We have no worry for the future unless we insulate ourselves with the promises of God, thinking that to us nothing like what happened to the Jews would happen to us. The work that has to be done is tremendous. It's beyond our comprehension. And all God is waiting for us to do is to depend on Him. To quit depending on our talent, on our wisdom and all. And I believe that God is going to do something for this people when we are ready and willing, that if God were to say, I'm going to take these 10 hospitals away from you. What? You don't need all those schools. Wham! You don't need all those assets. Wham! And we can stand there and say, right on, King Jesus. And we can stand there in the power of His glory and move a world that is in such desperate need. Have you ever read in Matthew 16:18? Where Jesus stood and said to Peter, Peter, your name is a stone, but the rock of your confession, on that rock I will build my church. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Do you know what kind of a picture we get out of that? We get a picture of a little church, a little white church with a picket fence standing up on a hill, fighting off the enemies that come at it. Oh no, that's not what Jesus had in mind. Did you know that? He didn't have that in mind. You know what He had in mind? He didn't have a church standing defensively. He had a church that was storming the very citadels of hell. You've never seen a city take its gates when it goes and fights. The gates of hell shall not prevail. It's an aggressive church that moves out into the world not afraid. Going out and touching men and women. Going, if it is, right into the very heart and center of the headquarters of evil and snatching out those firebrands. That's the picture. Let me read to you what that good lady has said. The Church of Christ is God's agency for the proclamation of truth. And by the way, we don't have a message to proclaim. We have the message. We don't have a solution, we have the solution. She is empowered by him to do a special work. And if she is loyal to God, obedient to his commandments, there will dwell within her, I love this, the excellence of divine power. If she will honor the Lord of Israel, there is no power that can stand against her. If she will be true to her allegiance, the forces of the enemy will be no more able to overpower her than is the chaff to resist the whirlwind. There is before the church the dawn of a bright and glorious day. If she will put on the robe of Christ's righteousness, withdrawing from all allegiance to the world. Do you know when God is going to send miracles to us? When we quit having the situation well in hand. Then the miracles will flood like we never believed. And to every one of us is given the privilege of being the channel of God's promises. Wonderful. Dr. Theodore Parker Ferris, who was pastor of the Protestant, of the Trinity Protestant Episcopal Church in Boston, told a very interesting story. He said he was on his way on the Queen Mary from England, and they were supposed to land the next day at 1 o'clock. 5 o'clock that morning, he was asleep, and that great ship began to list. It kept on listing. So he got up. He looked out the porthole, and sure enough, that ship was listing because it was turning. And as he kept looking, he noticed there was a little sailboat, 20 to 30 feet long, and on it there were two young men. And the ship came up close to that little sailboat, and he could hear them talking, but he couldn't hear the captain. And those two young men said, "We don't know where we are." And he said that those words went through him like a sword. He said to the day he couldn't forget those words. They told the captain that they had lost their rudder, their compass, their chart, and their sail. We're lost, they said. We have no idea where we are. And judging by what they were telling the captain, they declined to come on board. They said, "Would you please notify the Coast Guard and tell them to send help? We know that we'll be safe. We can wait." And then they said thanks to the captain, and off went the ship. And as he was going away, he looked at that little boat, and there he noticed the name. It was called the Castaway. And the church is churning through this stormy sea of life today. Stormy, we've never believed it could be a stormy. And this world, there are thousands that are just dying to hear the message. They don't know where they are. But if this church decides that Christ will be supreme, that it will not be our cleverness or manipulation, but it'll be total, outright dependence on Him, that His will be done, then this church will chart its way wonderfully and carefully onto the haven, bringing men and women who are cast away into contact with Him who will lead them there as well. What does the hymn say? Though with a scornful wonder men see her sorrow pressed, though foes would rend asunder the rock where she doth rest, yet saints their faith are keeping, their cry goes up, how long? And soon the night of weeping shall be the morn of song. Mid toil and tribulation and tumult of her war, she waits the consummation of peace forevermore, till with a vision glorious her longing eyes are blessed, and the great church of victorious shall be the church at rest. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it marvelous? Isn't it glorious that you have been given the privilege of being a servant of God? Shall we this day commit ourselves to the sovereignty of Jesus Christ, to the dedication of the mission that he came to accomplish in this world, and to give our whole beings to that mission? And then we shall stand and say, behold the glory of the Lord.
That was Elder Robert Zamora with the sermon entitled Requiem for a Dead Church on the Early Word. Next week we'll have another special speaker. We're indebted to J. Lloyd Hobart for the preservation of these messages.